Today we're going to be changing the inner CV boot on the passenger side of a Gen 1 Acura NSX. For the CV boot change, we'll be using the old, I believe it's 2005, Larry B write-up on NSX driver for the NSX Club of America. That's the paper in the upper right. This is the kit that you want. So there's the Honda kit number. It comes with the grease, the CV boot, the bands, and the replacement nut. Raise the car, remove the wheel. With the car in the air and the tire removed, the next thing we need to do is remove the axle nut. There is a punch washer, whatever the word is, the locking feature. The groove here is about 7 millimeters. What I did at the recommendation of the article in NSX Driver was create a custom chisel, which you can kind of just pop in here and pop that nut up. Alternatively, you can cut relief marks here and here with a Dremel. With the axle nut's locking feature disengaged, we now remove the axle nut. The nut is 36 millimeters. I highly recommend the impact driver for this activity. Probably going to need air as well. And there we have it. The next thing we need to do is mark the camber setting so we can put it back together in roughly the same alignment. So now we need to mark our camber adjustment so when we reinstall all these components we can maintain the basic alignment. Scribing a mark is your best plan, so you want to use this washer and this portion of the A-arm, and that will tell you, or that will accurately mark your part. Now we need to remove the rear rod beam. There are two 17 millimeter bolts on both sides and three 12 millimeter bolts on both sides. One of which is here, not this middle one, and then these two here. So here are the orientation of your bolts. So on the furthest side out, you have your 17 millimeter with this long bolt, a nut and a washer here, 17 millimeter again. This shorter bolt of these three with the pinned end or tapered end, these three are all 12 millimeter, and then the same on the other side. I found it helpful to put a bungee cord on the lower rod beam just to keep it from bouncing around. Now we need to remove the brake cable. If you follow this loop toward the rear of the car, it's at the back side of the car. This bolt right here, it's 12 millimeter. Next, we remove the rear toe link inboard bolt. It's 17 millimeter in this location here. Now we remove two 10 millimeter bolts here and here so we can remove the speed sensor bar that is attached to the lower arm. Next, we remove two 12 millimeter bolts from the bumper hanger bracket, here and here. Now we're going to remove the heat shield from basically around the CV joint. There are three 10 millimeter bolts, one here, and then one around the back. So here's the heat shield. So there's these three small nuts. These are 10 millimeters each. The heat shield sits like that on this angle, like here. So it's kind of tough to get to this upper one here, but the ones on the bottom are pretty easy to get to. But in any case, it's relatively self-explanatory. Next, we need to remove the front and lower A-frame bolt. This is the front, and this is the lower. They are 19 millimeter sockets or wrenches on either end. With the front and rear lower A-arm bolts removed, now we need to get the A-arm itself dropped and then also the toe link off the back here. Now with everything loose and all the bolts and tie rods undone and pushed down, it's time to remove the half shaft. Now what we need to do is we use a ball peen hammer and another hammer to tap the shaft so it frees up from the hub. Nice and easy. So it was difficult to film popping the shaft out. For mine, it popped out pretty easily. So you need to be 180 degrees off, so 2 separate pry bars. Or what some folks do is they put a shim on one side and then a pry bar on the other. So they kind of preload it on one side and then they attack with the other side a little bit, and that can pop it out as well. For my car, it was really easy. I was surprised. Now we're able to remove the shaft. Here we have our CV joint. So this is the passenger side of the car, and this side here is the inside, which goes to the transmission. This particular boot here is the one that tends to fail earlier, which has to do with heat in that particular area. In general, if you're going to go through the trouble of changing this boot, you should change this one as well. We'll carefully note while working on this CV shaft, there are a lot of extremely important points. This has to come apart, well, it doesn't have to come apart a certain way, but it absolutely has to go back together a certain way. So we're going to be very careful about labeling where parts came from and then where they need to go back to, because this is the kind of part that you have to be very careful with. So the first thing we're going to do is remove these bands. And this appears to not be OEM because these are the, I don't know what you call it, but the click-on CV boot straps. The OEM ones are a slightly different animal, but we'll show you that later. So in this case, now you can either cut these off, or with this particular version of strap that was used on this car, we have this, I don't know what you call these things, some kind of CV boot pliers, CV boot strap pliers, clamp pliers. Okay, before, not after, before we separate the internal spider, so to speak, with the CV outer casing, it is very, very important that we know which of these pieces goes into which slot. So we're going to number the outside of this and be very careful about which one of these goes with which piece. In addition to that, you also want to know the orientation. This is going to be a square piece when it slides out. I'll put a clip to it or something in advance. We want to make sure that the angle that it goes in is also retained, because you can get into some trouble with these. Now we've marked the outer case and we've made a location on our paper to place these items. So we very carefully pull this apart. And see, these things want to dance around. We need to maintain one, and then also the orientation that this is going in. This is 2. This is 3. Now, also important, so these splines, this spline goes with, so this was number 1, this spline goes with this piece, and this spline goes with this location. So we don't want to lose track of which spline goes where. Before we start messing around with making marks and such, we're going to clean this really good with brake cleaner. Okay, so now our joint is cleaned up, and you can see that on this particular case, I'm amazed it held, but there is white paint from when this shaft was clearly handled before. So amazingly enough, that paint retained itself. We're going to try to make a punch mark or some kind of mark so it cannot be wiped away. To ensure I don't lose track of which spline is one as I marked it on the outer case of the shaft, I got one of those paint markers and we're going to mark that down. Looks like they're a lot more permanent than I anticipated based on the marks we see from a previous job. So we had a little bit of a tough time using a punch, so I was going to use this small Dremel thing just to make a little mark, so we're going to give that a shot. Looks like that worked. So it was difficult to make a mark in this, but we got a little mark here aligned with that tooth there, and then a little mark here. I'm also going to use some paint just to make sure that we can keep track of that mark. Next, we need to remove the retaining ring that goes around here. This is position 1 in the figure that I'll show you. I got a pair of retaining ring pliers. We'll see if this will take that off. Now we can remove the spider. Now we remove the inner set ring, and that's item number 2 on the pictorial. Okay, now that we have the retaining rings off, the spider off, now we can take the boot off the other side. So first we need to remove the clips. Personally, I kind of like these clips because they're removable and they're strong and they kind of are self-setting. I can look up and try to see what size these are. 95.7 OETPAT, whatever that means. I don't know if that's the size or just some patent number. Okay, now we again want to be careful when we pull this boot off, because once we pull the boot off, then we want to mark the outer canister and we want to mark the internal shaft to make sure we have the spider in the correct orientation. It is not 1-to-1. They're off by a 60-degree angle. I'll show you that pictorial. So even though the 1 is in alignment here, so there's a shaft coming off here on that one side, on this side it should be clocked 60 degrees, and it better be. So we picked up one of these paint markers, which supposedly it's permanent, and based on the fact that when we took this joint apart we saw similar type markings that were still on there after I bought the car with 42,000 miles. It's got 68 now, so it made it all that way at least. Although Larry himself may actually have replaced one of these boots, I can't recall offhand. Okay, so now we're pretty much at the point where we can put the CV boots back on, or replace the CV boots. So this is the kit that you want. So there are the numbers so you can see them. I bought 2 of them, so we'll be replacing those now. Okay, now we will get the boot on, and again this is the wheel side, so the outer side, and again this is the passenger side of the car. So you might be asking yourself, why did he not clean the grease out? So you probably should clean the grease out, but basically because this boot was intact and I'm simply replacing the boot since I'm here, we just added a little bit of grease from the kit and we're kind of going with that. The outside one, which was torn, that one we're going to clean out in its entirety. So maybe that's a bad practice, but that's what we're doing. On this side, we're going to be using the strap I already took off. This is used. That's the plan I'm going with. I really like these straps because they kind of lock in and it's a very positive fit. We will be doing the OEM Honda ones on the other joints, so I'll show you how to do that with a special tool that they have. So I'm using these regular needle nose. They're really strong needle nose. I think that'll work better. Just gotta get under there. That goes there. There we go. Almost done. Wow, that's a lot of force. There it is. Perfect. Okay, so these clips, like I was mentioning, so you're basically grabbing these 2 points here and you're squeezing them until you get a click out here. So this seated nicely. It's very secure, so I'm going with that. So this end of the CV boot has kind of a groove to sit into. So here's the upper piece. Kind of tough to see, but there's a little indentation right here. That is where the CV boot seats. Okay, so now we will put the clamp on the inside portion of the boot. Again, I'm using the pre-fabricated kind, whatever you call it. Numbers on this, by the way, are 35 OET. My guess is it's 35 millimeter, but I'll research that later. And there we have it. Okay, before we put the clip on, let's be smart about it and put the boot on first. Okay, so now we've got our lower boot on, so it is time to put on the retaining clip on the inside, and then we can get our spider on and the retaining clip on the outside. After that, we start reassembling the joint. Okay, so it's time to get the ring on. This is the thicker of the two rings that come in the kit. So the kit does give you new rings. May as well use the new rings. Okay, so I just wrecked one of these, so you gotta be careful. This can't be split open too much. So this is already, I lost the gap. This was the original gap, which was pretty tight. I mean, it'll be a little bit bigger than this when it's snapped on, but this is too big. Now it's almost like it's loose. So don't do that. It needs to just kind of slide over the splines and that's it. Now we're putting a light coat of grease on the splines. We'll also get some grease on the splines. Sorry, on the spider, which is on the splines of the spider. Okay, and then we got our mark. That mark needs to match with this mark, so we'll slide it on there and make sure we're good. Okay, so we were super careful to make sure that these line up perfectly, and they do. Now we're ready for the snap ring that goes over the top here. And there we have it. Okay, so now we are working with the CV joint that was split. So this one we do need to clean out because dirt could have gotten in there because the boot was compromised. So we want to clean this out real good, so lots of paper towels, a little brake fluid, etc. Okay, so we got pretty good shape here. It's about as clean as I think we're going to get it, about 90%. I used brake cleaner and a whole mess of paper towels. Now we need to clean the, I guess they're the bearings that go on the spider. Bushings, maybe you want to call them. Now this is where things get a little bit exciting because I need to make sure this end here is the one that goes into the shaft. So it goes in this way. So this will go on the spider. This is 3 in that position. But we just got to keep track of that while we're cleaning it. Okay, on these items, so these are actual bearings. I thought they were bushings. These are actual bearings, so I don't want to spray a ton of brake cleaner in here and actually start getting the grease out of the bearing. So I'm going to get it about 90% like this, and we're going to go with that when we put it on the shaft, and the new grease will kind of cover anything that's missing. In addition to that, this CV boot, although it was compromised, we didn't find any grit, any dirt of any sort. So although it does need to be cleaned out, we didn't find a whole lot of whatever contaminant that seemed like it was of concern, like sand or anything like that. Just to be 100% sure, I'm going to put a little dot here just to make sure I know which side goes out, but I'm trying to hold that orientation anyway. So now we're going to take our canister, fill it up with grease, and prepare it for the installation. Okay, so now we're just about ready to install the spline into the can. So we want to get grease on the edges on here and on this side and this side of all of these, so this slides in nice. Now this is an activity I think you need 2 people for. It would be really hard not to. So that definitely takes a little bit of maneuvering. I don't know how you would do that with 1 person, but nonetheless, we were able to pull it off, so now we're going to throw this back together. Okay, now we're going to be using the OEM Acura bands. I don't particularly love these bands. I know that folks do, but there's a special tool that you need. It's something to effect of this tool. There are a couple different versions of it. This one has a cutter on it, but this is the basic look of the tool. This is a KD3191 style tool. Okay, so now we take this band and we need to wrap it twice. So this is how this goes. So here is our, whatever you want to call this, the band goes through this channel. So we put this here. We got to wrap it around twice. So here's the first round. Okay. So now we have the first round. We got to go around a second time. So come around again. Come back through this clip again. And we hand tighten this. Make sure this is uniform and in the slot for the boot. Tighten it up by hand as best you can. Should be pretty snug. Okay, so once we have this tightened, hand tight as best we can do, if this is an old boot, which I would never put on, but if you had an old boot, you would put it at, you would make a mark from this location to this location of 10 millimeters. If it's a new boot, which still has some room for compression, you go to 14 millimeters. So here we go. I made a red mark approximately where 14 millimeters is, so it's right there. So we'll consider this our mark. Okay, once that's marked, now we move to the tool. So we have it lying on its side now. Again, this is tightened in 2 runs around, not 1. You go around twice, you have about yay amount left. And then we made this distance, again, that was 14 millimeters. So there's the 14 millimeters. Now we take our tool, and this pops through here. And then we gotta go through, there's a channel in this side as well. Okay. Pop this out of here. Like this. Then what we do is we tighten this until this red mark makes it to here. So there we are. The red mark is in alignment with the clip or sleeve, whatever you call it. Then you turn this 90 degrees, like that. And then this piece here is a cutting tool, and we cut. I wanted to quickly follow up on this tool, so I figured out what went wrong. It wasn't cutting, it's because I had gone through here with this in this orientation. I didn't realize that if you put it in this orientation, you can get through there. So it goes through in this orientation, and then when you go to cut it, it's actually pressing it against these ends. So this tool probably would have worked fine. I was just doing it wrong. No surprise. So we had a little bit of difficulty with this cutter. We may have set this up wrong, but in any case, you got to get it folded over. You can kind of tap this down with a screwdriver because what you don't want is that red line to slide. So now that we've kind of knocked it in place, we're going to unwind this and get it out of the way. Okay, so that's the way it works for the OEM Honda ones. I'm not a big fan of these particular clips. I like these automatic snap-on clips a little bit better, but even Larry himself had mentioned in his notes that he likes these if they're done properly. So now the question is did I do it properly? I think so. We're going to go with that. Next, we are going to be installing the drive shaft back into the car. We start with the axle side, so the wheel side, and we need to slowly put these splines through the wheel, hub, axle, whatever you want to call it. These threads or splines need to be cleaned up really well. I was going to use grease from the CV joint, but the article suggests just a little WD-40 because you want it as clean as possible. So we took a little oil from the seal inside of the half shaft, and we're just kind of covering it up and giving it a light coating to help it get installed. Okay, so now we're going to be installing the shaft in the car. You will notice that things don't look like they did when we took the shaft out. So this is undone, the brake caliper's off, the discs are off, and the upper control arm is missing. So let's overlook that. I'm installing a camber kit at the same time I'm doing this CV boot, so I didn't want to have to do two complete videos. So that's the reason you are seeing these other components off, but I'll continue to install it as if those were where they're supposed to be. When installing the CV shaft, it is done by hand, and the first end to be put in is the axle nut side, so the outer side of the vehicle. Do that gently, slide that in, and then we move to the transmission side. Okay, so it's important to know that you put the shaft in by hand, so it went in pretty easy for me. You want to make sure you have enough threads where you can use the nut to kind of pull the shaft in. We're only doing this loosely at this point in time. We will tighten it up later. Okay, now we've got that side in, we'll move to the other side. Next, we install the bolts and the alignment bolt for the lower A arm. So here are your two bolts. So this guy goes up front here, and this guy goes back here. So we'll install those now. So these are 19 millimeter nuts and bolts. The first thing we want to do is get this A arm in place. When going through this process, you just want to be pretty careful to make sure you're not stressing the A-arm too much, so you don't want to tighten either side without the other side getting in there. We went under there with a flashlight and kind of a rubber mallet to align things as best we could by eye, and then slowly kind of pop the bolts in. Now we will tighten the bolts on both the front and the rear of the lower A-arm. The torque is 125 Newton meters, and we also need to be conscious of and realign the camber setting where we had marked it. So recall we had our alignment setting here. My mark is not showing because the alignment piece was actually flipped upside down, so I turned it back around, but I know what the alignment setting needs to be. You turn that alignment setting based on the bolt head on the opposite side. Here we can see as we turn this bolt head, the uneven size washer of sorts aligns the rear arm. So align that with where you had left your marks. Again, mine aren't showing, but that's where it's supposed to be right here. And then tighten down to 125 Newton meters. Now we snug up the front bolt on the lower control arm. That is also 125 Newton meters. Now we reinstall our heat shield. This heat shield with the two bolts is approximately in this position here. And here are our 10 millimeter bolts. Next, we reinstall the exhaust hanger bracket, which has two 12 millimeter bolts. Next, we install the speed sensor bar. There are two 10 millimeter bolts. Now we have this bar in place. Again, it bolted to the lower control arm, 10 millimeters. Now we reinstall the rear toe link. The torque on this is 95 Newton meters. These are 17 millimeter bolts. Next, we reinstall our brake cable attachment. which goes up here. The bolt is just lightly set in there. And this nub here goes into this link here. And that's a 12mm bolt. Here I have a slightly different orientation from when I was explaining this on the removal. So if the front of the car is that way, this is your rear beam. Now you have two 17mm bolts on the sides, and then these three here, per side of course, is 14mm. These are 95 Newton meters, so this bolt and this nut, and these are 60 Newton meters. Okay, now it is time to put the wheel back on, and we are tightening the wheel on so we can lower the car, because let's recall that this nut is not yet torqued, and we do need to do that and I guess you'd call it stake the lock nut. Also, if you have aftermarket wheels that require centering caps, which I do, it's a good time to put those on so you don't forget to put them on. I am going to be putting my OEM wheel on first so I can get to this nut. Long story behind that, but I'll be putting the OEM wheel on first in order to do this. We now want to put the wheel on so we can lower the car and torque the axle nut. Key point, before you put the wheel on, you do need to pop the center cap off. You will notice that I'm going to use an impact gun to run the bolts down. Two things. One, make 100% sure you have hand threaded them on to start so you do not cross thread. Second, if you're going to use a gun to put the wheels on, do not do it fast. You have to do it slow because there is a chance that they will seize up. I've seized up OEM lug nuts before, and then I had to replace the studs. I don't know if that was a fluke or not, but it happened when I was trying to run the bolts down very quickly. It also, I believe, happened when I took them off one time. Now I'm super careful. With the wheel down, we can now torque the axle nut to 250 foot-pounds. Next step, we need to stake the axle nut, so the wheel's got to come back off. First, we're going to want to rotate the wheel until the stake position is in the upward direction. And now we remove the wheel. Now with the axle nut slot in the upper position, we just have to stake the axle nut. That's your locking feature. Choose a punch. Now we're ready to put the wheel on for real, and I get to move to my nice wheels, which I have missed. If you need a centering ring, don't forget to use it. And there we have it. We are ready to roll. So next step is to get in alignment, and then we should be good.